Welcome back to Family Shadows, a place where stories of fathers, family, sacrifice, and sometimes quiet revenge are told, not just to entertain, but to remind us of the values we often forget. If you've ever found yourself touched by the quiet strength of a parent, or if you believe in stories that carry lessons for life, I invite you to subscribe, join our community, and let these stories walk with you. Each week, we share a tale that feels both timeless and timely. Today's story is titled, "They Said I Had Nothing Saved, so I Showed Them the Retirement Fund They Couldn't Touch." George Miller had lived most of his 66 years quietly, almost invisibly to those who hadn't paid attention. He wasn't the kind of man who filled a room with his presence, not the one who demanded attention when he walked in. His wife, Margaret, used to say, "George has the kind of strength that whispers, not shouts." And she was right. For nearly 4 decades, George had risen before dawn, pulled on the same work boots until the leather split at the seams, and driven his old Ford truck down the same familiar roads to the factory on the edge of town. He worked with his hands day after day, year after year, not because he loved the sound of machines or the smell of steel, but because each hour meant food on the table, a mortgage payment met, and later, college tuition for his children. Now, the factory no longer needed him. His name had been moved from the schedule board to the list of retirees. The boot sat by the back door, collecting more dust than dirt these days. Retirement was supposed to be a reward, but George quickly learned that in the eyes of his children, David and Emily, it looked more like expiration. David, 36, was the sort of son who wore ambition like a tailored suit. He was sharp, decisive, the kind of man who shook hands firmly and always checked his reflection in the nearest window. Emily, 33, softer in tone but often echoing her brother's opinions, believed in stability in appearances, in doing what looked right. To them, George was no longer the provider. He was simply there, a figure in the background of their busy modern lives. One evening, George overheard something at the dinner table he would not forget. They had gathered, as they did sometimes, at David's house. The table was polished oak, the kind you never put a scratch on, and the wine was poured into tall glasses George never felt comfortable holding. Emily sat across from him, adjusting her bracelet now and then while David carved into the roast with precision. The conversation had been light until it wasn't. "So, Dad," David said almost casually, "how's retirement treating you?" George smiled faintly. "It's quieter, that's for sure." David chuckled. "Yeah, I bet. No paycheck coming in every week, huh?" Emily added, with what she thought was kindness but landed like pity. "At least you don't have to worry about work anymore. I mean, you don't really have much saved, do you?" George paused. His fork hovered above his plate. David leaned back in his chair, swirling the wine in his glass. "It's okay, Dad. Honestly, you don't have to stress. We'll make sure you're comfortable. You can just rely on us now. It's not like you've got some huge retirement fund tucked away somewhere, right?" The words hung in the air like smoke. George swallowed slowly, the roast suddenly dry in his mouth. He wanted to respond, but what would he say? That they were wrong. That beneath his quiet exterior, he had spent a lifetime not only feeding mouths and paying bills, but planning for a future no one thought he understood. Instead, he said nothing. He pressed his lips together and nodded. His children took his silence as agreement, as confirmation of their assumption. Their father was an old man with little left, a burden waiting to happen. Margaret had once warned him this might happen. She used to sit with him at the kitchen table late at night, the lamp casting a soft glow, her hands folded over his. "George," She'd say, "We can't control how our children see us, but we can control how we prepare for the day when they don't see us at all." And George had listened. Quietly, without announcing it, he had prepared. But in that dining room with his children looking at him as if he were an empty well, George felt the first sting of being dismissed, of being seen as a man past his usefulness. Later that night, back in his own home, a house that still smelled faintly of Margaret's lavender potpourri, George sat in his recliner. The television flickered, but he wasn't watching. His mind replayed the words. "You don't really have much saved, do you?" It wasn't just about money. It was about value. He thought of the decades of sacrifices, the double shifts, the vacations never taken, the clothes worn until threadbare. Also, David and Emily could live without feeling the edges of want. And now, because he no longer punched a clock, they saw him as finished. George leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He whispered into the empty room as if Margaret could still hear him. "They think I have nothing left. They really believe I'm empty." But George knew better. The drive home from David's house that night had been quiet. The roads were the same ones George had driven for 40 years, past the gas station that still sold coffee for 99 cents, past the faded billboard for a car dealership long gone, past the little park where he once pushed David on a swing and later watched Emily wobble on her first bicycle. Those roads had always felt steady, familiar. But that night, they seemed to echo with his son's words, bouncing against the windshield and back into his chest. "It's not like you've got some huge retirement fund tucked away somewhere, right?" George didn't answer them at dinner, but in the car he answered out loud, almost startling himself. "I do," he muttered, gripping the wheel tighter. "I do." He remembered the look on David's face, half smirk, half pity. It wasn't malicious, maybe, but it cut deeper because it was casual, the way you'd speak about an old chair you were ready to toss to the curb. Emily hadn't defended him. She never really contradicted David. Her silence had always been its own language. When George walked into his own kitchen, the smell of the house comforted him. It was the smell of old pine floors, of Margaret's curtains that still carried faint traces of her lavender spray. On the counter was the ceramic cookie jar she'd bought at a flea market, shaped like a plump rooster, its paint chipped near the tail. She had always called it their rainy day jar, and for years he'd stuffed spare dollars into it, singles, fives, even a 20 if the week had been kind. He went to it now, lifted the lid and smiled faintly at the modest stack of bills inside. It wasn't much, not compared to the numbers on the documents tucked in the locked drawer of his desk upstairs, but it was proof of who he was, a man who thought ahead, a man who saved quietly because loud money was often wasted money. Upstairs, George opened the drawer. Inside were the neatly filed papers he had kept since the early 80s. Statements from the retirement accounts he had built, small contributions at first, growing bit by bit over the decades. He had chosen funds carefully, sought advice from the old union treasurer, and kept up with the payments even when money was tight. He had never boasted, never flaunted. Margaret had been the only one who knew, and when she passed, the responsibility to keep it safe doubled in his mind. He sat with the papers spread across the desk. The numbers were not enormous, not in the way billionaires bragged about on the news, but they were steady, reliable, and protected by the law, enough to ensure he would never need to beg, never need to sign away the roof above his head. Enough to remind him that his years of labor had meaning. But to his children, none of that existed. In their eyes, his worth ended when the factory clock no longer ticked him in. The next week, David stopped by his father's house. It was unusual. David rarely came alone. He walked in with the same quick stride, wearing a navy suit though it was Saturday. He sat at the kitchen table without waiting to be invited, like he already owned the space. "Dad," he began, folding his hands, "we need to talk about the house." George looked up from his mug of coffee. "What about it?" David leaned forward, his voice measured the way he spoke in meetings. "You're not working anymore. Maintaining this place is a lot. The taxes, the repairs, it's too much for you. Emily and I were talking. It'd make sense to transfer the deed. That way we can manage it, maybe rent it out, maybe even sell down the road. You wouldn't have to worry." George's fingers tightened around the mug. He said nothing, so David continued. "You've done enough, Dad. It's time for us to take over. You can move into a smaller condo, something easier. Honestly, it's the smart move. You don't really have savings, so why hold onto something you can't manage?" There it was again, that assumption spoken as fact. You don't really have savings. George's silence stretched long enough for David to shift uncomfortably. Finally, George said, "This house is paid for. I can manage it." David shook his head gently, as if humoring a child. "Dad, come on. You can't keep holding onto it just for nostalgia. Think about the future. Think about us." George thought of Margaret. He thought of her planting roses by the porch, her laughter drifting through the hallways. He thought of Christmas mornings with the children tearing through wrapping paper, of long summer nights when they slept with the windows open and the crickets sang them to sleep. This house was not a burden. It was a life. But David didn't see any of that. To him, the house was equity, a piece on a chessboard to be moved. George excused himself, stood slowly, and went upstairs to his study. He closed the door and leaned against it. His chest was heavy, his mind buzzing. He pulled the drawer open again and looked at the folders. He traced the numbers with his finger as if to remind himself they were real. He whispered to Margaret, though she was long gone, "They think I have nothing. They think I'm empty. But you and I, we prepared, didn't we?" That night he dreamt of his wife. She was standing in the yard, waving him in for supper, the way she had for years. He woke with tears on his cheeks, the papers still spread across the desk like a shield no one else could see. When Sunday came, Emily called. Her voice was sweet, careful, as though she were wrapping her words in sugar. "Dad, David told me he talked to you about the house. I think he's right. It's not that we don't appreciate everything you've done. We do. But you shouldn't have to handle everything on your own anymore. Let us carry the load." George could almost hear David coaching her words. He sighed into the receiver. "Emily, I'm fine here. I don't need you to carry me." There was a pause, then a sigh on her end too. "Dad, we just don't want you to end up with nothing. You've worked so hard, but, well, you don't have much saved. We know that. We just want to make sure you're safe." The word safe felt like a blade wrapped in velvet. They weren't protecting him. They were preparing to manage him, to tuck him into a corner where he wouldn't inconvenience their lives. George hung up politely, but when he set the phone down, his hands trembled. That evening, he walked out to the porch. The sun was setting, staining the sky orange and gold. He remembered how Margaret loved sunsets, how she'd sit with a glass of iced tea and say, "Look, George, the sky's putting on a show just for us." He looked at the horizon now and said softly, "They think I'm finished, but I'm not. Not yet." The crickets began their chorus, and in that song George felt a quiet determination take root. He would not hand over his life as if it were already over. He would not sign away his dignity. They believed he had nothing. Soon they would learn just how wrong they were. A week passed before George saw David again. This time, his son didn't come alone. Emily was with him, and together they stepped into George's home as if they had rehearsed the visit beforehand. The air outside was brisk with the promise of winter, but George felt a different chill sweep through the house the moment they arrived. David didn't waste time on pleasantries. He laid a thick manila folder on the kitchen table, slid it forward with a deliberate push, and said, "Dad, we've taken the liberty of putting some papers together. Nothing final, just preliminary. It's about the house." Emily, sitting across from her father, offered a faint smile as though she hoped it might soften the blow. "We just want to help, Dad, that's all." George looked down at the folder. The edges were too sharp, the manila too clean, like it didn't belong in his kitchen with its cracked tiles and chipped mugs. He didn't open it. David leaned back, adjusting his cufflinks the way he always did when he thought he was in control. "Here's the reality," he said. "You're retired. That's great, but it means no new income. The house is an asset, and right now it's just sitting here. If we transfer ownership, we can make sure it stays valuable. Emily and I can take care of taxes, upkeep, maybe even leverage it for something bigger. You won't have to stress about a thing." George's voice was quiet but steady. "I'm not stressed about the house." David sighed. "Dad, come on, you're living in the past. Nostalgia doesn't pay property taxes. What happens in a few years when you really can't manage anymore?" Emily's eyes flicked between her brother and her father. "We're not saying you've done anything wrong. You've worked hard all your life, but you don't really have anything saved up, Dad. You know that. This is just practical." The words landed like stones. George could almost hear Margaret's laughter echoing through the halls as if she were standing behind him whispering, "Hold your ground, George." He folded his hands in front of him. "This house is mine. It's where your mother and I built our life. I'm not signing it away." The silence that followed was heavy. David tapped his fingers on the folder. His jaw tightened. "Dad, don't make this harder than it needs to be." George met his son's eyes. For a long moment, it felt like they weren't father and son, but two men on opposite sides of a line. Finally, George stood, his chair scraping against the floor. "Take the papers back," he said. "I won't look at them." Emily reached out, her voice pleading. "Dad, please, we're only thinking of you." George shook his head. "No, you're thinking of yourselves." The words seemed to surprise even him. He wasn't a man who raised his voice. He wasn't one to accuse, but he had lived long enough to recognize when love had turned into leverage. David shoved the folder back into his briefcase with more force than necessary. "Fine," he muttered, "but this conversation isn't over." He stood, buttoning his jacket, and Emily followed reluctantly. When the door closed behind them, George sank back into his chair. His heart was pounding, not from fear but from the weight of realization. His children saw him not as a father anymore, not as the man who had worked and bled for their futures, but as a liability standing in the way of their plans. That night, George didn't sleep. He wandered the house instead, touching the walls, the door frames, the pictures still hanging in the hallway. In each frame, the past smiled back at him. David at his high school graduation, Emily holding her first trophy, Margaret with her arm looped through his on a long-ago summer day. Every picture told a story of a man who had given everything he had. Now those same children sat across from him with contracts, trying to carve his life into pieces they could own. He ended up in his study again, the one place that still felt like his. He opened the desk drawer and pulled out the retirement folders. He spread them across the table as though they were battle plans. Each page was a reminder. He was not empty. He had saved. He had prepared. And though his children didn't know it, the law was on his side. He whispered into the quiet, "They think I'm finished, but they have no idea." The next morning, as the sun rose pale and cold through the window, George brewed a pot of coffee and sat with the papers again. This time, he didn't just read the numbers. He felt them. They were years of missed vacations, of worn shoes, of long nights working overtime. They were sacrifices Margaret had encouraged and he had carried out. They were proof of his dignity. And as he stared at the numbers, George made himself a promise. He would not let his children strip him of what he had built. He would not sign away his life for their convenience. The fight was coming, and for the first time in a long time, George felt ready. The house felt emptier after they left, as if David and Emily had carried the air out with them. George moved slowly through the rooms, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. He paused by the window, looking out at the bare branches scratching against the winter sky. There had been a time when this place was alive with noise, children racing up the stairs, Margaret calling them down for dinner, the television humming with ball games on Sunday afternoons. Now the only sound was the creak of the old floorboards and the faint hum of the furnace. He lowered himself into the armchair by the fireplace, the one Margaret used to favor on cold nights. Her knitting basket still sat nearby, a half-finished scarf folded neatly inside as though she might return at any moment to pick up where she had left off. George reached down and touched the yarn, and for a fleeting second he swore he could feel the warmth of her hands lingering in the fibers. "Margaret," he whispered into the silence. "What would you say to them? What would you tell me to do?" Of course, there was no answer. Just the ticking of the old wall clock, steady and unbothered, as if reminding him that time moved forward whether he wanted it to or not. George leaned back, closed his eyes, and let the memories come. He saw David as a boy, standing in the yard with a baseball glove too big for his hand. He saw Emily in her Sunday dress, clutching a schoolbook to her chest and asking if he'd be there for her recital. He remembered the promises he had made back then, to give them more than he had ever been given, to make sure they never felt the scrape of hunger or the ache of cold winters. He had kept those promises. Every blister, every callus, every overtime shift had been for them. And now, in their grown-up eyes, he was reduced to a man with no savings, no plan, no worth. The weight of it pressed on his chest until he rose abruptly, restless. He walked to the study, opened the drawer, and spread the retirement papers across the desk again. The numbers glowed faintly in the lamplight like hidden stars. Here, in ink and signatures, was the story they didn't know. He had been building this future for decades, not because he wanted applause, but because he believed in responsibility. He remembered Margaret's voice, firm and steady. "We have to think ahead, George. We won't always be strong, but if we prepare, we won't have to depend on anyone else." That was why he never touched the fund, not once, no matter how tempting it might have been during lean years. When the car needed repairs, he fixed it himself instead of pulling from the account. When the roof leaked, he climbed up and patched it, even though his knees ached for days afterward. When the children begged for expensive shoes or the newest gadgets, he said no more often than he wanted to, choosing instead to put a little extra into the fund. Every sacrifice had added up to these pages, this quiet legacy. But as he sat staring at the documents, George felt something deeper than pride. He felt loneliness. Because what was the value of a man's careful planning if his own children couldn't see it? What did it mean to have secured a future if the people he had secured it for no longer respected the man who built it? He pressed his palms against the desk and lowered his head. His shoulders trembled with the weight of it all, not just the disappointment in David and Emily, but the sharp ache of Margaret's absence. She had been his partner in every choice, his anchor through storms. Now he faced this battle alone. The phone rang, startling him. He let it ring once, twice, 3 times before picking up. It was Emily. Her voice was soft, but George could hear the unease beneath it. "Dad, I know David was firm today, maybe too firm, but he's only looking out for you. We both are. You can't keep handling everything by yourself. We don't want you to get hurt down the line." George's throat tightened. "Emily," he said gently, "do you really think I have nothing left? Do you think I've spent my whole life working and saving for it to end like this?" There was a pause on the line. "We just don't want you to be left with nothing," she repeated, almost like she was reciting lines someone else had given her. George closed his eyes. "I'll be fine, I promise you." He hung up before she could reply. He sat in the quiet again, staring at the documents, feeling their weight like a secret weapon he wasn't ready to use. Not yet. Hours passed. The sky outside deepened into darkness, and the stars came out one by one. George finally rose from the desk, folded the papers carefully, and locked them away again. He walked back to the living room and lowered himself into Margaret's chair, the scarf still tucked neatly in the basket at his feet. As he drifted toward sleep, he thought of the word his children had used again and again: nothing. They believed he had nothing, but they were wrong. And when the time came, he would show them just how much a lifetime of quiet sacrifice was worth. The knock on the door came on a Thursday afternoon, sharp and insistent, the kind of knock that didn't wait to be invited. George set aside his coffee and shuffled to the front hall. When he opened the door, David stood there in his pressed suit, his jaw set like stone. Emily lingered just behind him, her coat buttoned high, eyes lowered as though she didn't quite want to meet her father's gaze. "Dad," David said, stepping inside without waiting, "we need to settle this." George frowned. "Settle what?" "The house," David replied, as if the word itself were a simple equation. He pulled the same manila folder from his briefcase, this time sliding it across the kitchen table with more force than before. "We've drawn up the documents. All that's left is your signature." George didn't sit. He stood at the edge of the table, staring at the folder like it was a snake coiled and ready to strike. "I told you before," he said slowly, "I'm not signing anything." Emily spoke then, her voice careful. "Dad, please. This isn't about taking anything from you, it's about protecting you. What if something happens? What if you fall behind on taxes, or the roof caves in, or—" She trailed off, her words crumbling under her father's silence. David filled the gap. "This is common sense. You're living alone in a house too big for one person with no steady income and no savings. We're trying to keep you from losing everything. You sign the deed over and we take responsibility. You'll never have to worry again." George's hands trembled, not with weakness but with anger he hadn't felt in years. He sat down slowly, folded his fingers together and looked at his son. "David," he said softly, "do you remember when you broke your arm falling out of the oak tree in the backyard? Who carried you 6 blocks to the doctor because the car wouldn't start?" David shifted. "Dad, that was—" "Do you remember, Emily?" George continued, turning to her. "When you stood on that stage at your first recital, too nervous to play, and I whispered from the front row, 'I'm here, sweetheart, just play for me.' Do you remember who worked nights, weekends, double shifts, so both of you could go to college?" The kitchen went quiet. David's lips pressed into a thin line. Emily looked down at her lap. "I didn't do all of that so you could sit here and treat me like a man who has nothing," George said. His voice trembled now, not from weakness but from the ache of years carried in silence. This house isn't just walls and wood. It's your mother's laughter, your childhood, my entire life's work, and you want me to sign it away like it's nothing. David's face hardened. Dad, you're being sentimental. That's exactly the problem. You're not thinking about the future. If you don't sign, we can't protect you. You'll regret it later. The words landed like a gavel. Sign or suffer the consequences. Emily reached across the table, her eyes pleading. Dad, please don't make this harder than it has to be. George looked at her hand, then at the folder. He could feel the weight of their assumptions pressing down on him. The quiet verdict that he was done, finished. A man without savings, clinging to memories instead of sense. He stood, pushing the folder back toward David. No, he said simply. David's jaw tightened. You're making a mistake. George shook his head. The mistake would be giving up the only thing I've built with my own hands just to satisfy your fear. I may be old, but I'm not helpless, and I'm not signing. The silence that followed was suffocating. Emily blinked back tears. David shoved the folder into his briefcase with a snap. This isn't over, David said, his voice low and sharp. When they left, the house felt heavy again. But this time, George didn't sink beneath the weight. He walked straight to his study, unlocked the drawer, and laid the retirement papers out across the desk. His heart still pounded from the confrontation, but as he traced the numbers on those pages, a calm began to settle over him. They thought they were cornering him, but they didn't know what he had. They didn't know the quiet power of decades of sacrifice. As the night fell and shadows stretched across the walls, George whispered into the quiet, "You think I have nothing. Soon you'll see just how wrong you are." The days after that confrontation moved slowly, each one weighed down by the echo of David's sharp words. "You're making a mistake." George carried them around like stones in his pockets, heavy but grounding. He went about his routines, brewing his coffee in the mornings, walking to the mailbox, tending to the small patch of garden out back, even though the season was too cold for anything to bloom. Outwardly, nothing seemed different. To a neighbor glancing over the fence, George was just another retired man passing quiet hours in his old house. But inside, something had shifted. He was no longer only the quiet father they assumed was helpless. He had begun to draw a line. One evening, he found himself at the kitchen table, with the old photo albums spread out in front of him. The pictures felt heavier now, each one carrying a story his children seemed to have forgotten. Here was David in his little league uniform, his cap too big for his head. George could remember every Saturday morning spent coaching, every ice cream cone after a win, every hug after a loss. And there was Emily, smiling shyly in her prom dress, her mother adjusting the hem while George stood to the side, teary-eyed and proud. Looking at those images, he realized something. His resistance wasn't only about property or papers or even money. It was about memory. It was about refusing to let the life he had built be reduced to an asset column in his children's eyes. That night, George pulled out the retirement folders again. He read through them carefully as if studying scripture. Each page told a story not just of numbers, but of choices. He could see Margaret's hand in them, her insistence that they put a little aside every month, her patience when they skipped small luxuries so the fund could grow. As he studied the documents, he noticed something he had almost forgotten: the legal protections. The account wasn't just money in a bank. It was bound in contracts, protected by law, structured in such a way that no one, not even his children, could touch it. The realization steadied him. He wasn't at their mercy. He had already built the wall that would keep him safe. The next weekend, David returned. He walked in briskly, no smile, carrying the same briefcase. "Dad," he began, "Emily and I have talked again. We're giving you one more chance to do this the easy way. If you sign now, everything stays smooth. If not, we'll have to start looking into other options." George looked at him calmly. Other options. David hesitated just long enough for George to see the bluff in his eyes. "We'll figure it out, but don't put us in that position." George nodded slowly as though considering it. Then he said, "I'm not signing." His tone was so even it startled David. There was no anger, no tremor, just certainty. David clenched his jaw. "Why are you being so stubborn?" George leaned back in his chair. "Because this house is mine. Because your mother's laughter still lives in these walls. Because I am not finished, no matter what you think." For once, David didn't have an immediate reply. He stared at his father, perhaps searching for weakness, but George only met his gaze, steady and unyielding. The silence stretched until David snapped the briefcase shut and stormed out. Emily called later that evening, her voice trembling. "Dad, why won't you just work with us? We only want what's best for you." George sighed. "No, Emily, you want what's easiest for you, and that's not the same." When he hung up, he felt the ache of loneliness again. But beneath it, there was something stronger, resolve. He would not let them take his dignity. He would not surrender his life's work under pressure. That night, he sat in his study, a single lamp casting shadows across the desk. He opened the folders one more time, but instead of just reading, he began to organize them. He stacked the documents neatly, placed them in a fireproof box, and locked it tight. Then he slid the box into the closet, behind a row of Margaret's old coats he could never bring himself to give away. It was a small gesture, but it felt like armor. He was protecting not just paper, but the proof of a lifetime. As he turned off the light and walked to bed, George felt a quiet strength he hadn't known in years. His children believed they had cornered him, but they had underestimated the man who had carried them, fed them, clothed them, and saved for them long before they knew the meaning of sacrifice. He whispered into the dark as if Margaret could hear him still. "I'm ready. When the time comes, they'll see." The breaking point came on a Sunday afternoon. George had invited David and Emily over, though his message had been brief. "Come by, we need to talk." He brewed a pot of coffee before they arrived, set out the same old mugs Margaret had loved, chipped, mismatched, but warm with history. He placed the mugs on the table, then set down a small wooden box beside them. It was the kind of box that didn't look like much, plain oak, scratched along the edges from decades of use. But inside it was the weight of a lifetime. David and Emily arrived together, coats buttoned against the cold, their faces tight with expectation. David carried no briefcase this time. He must have assumed this meeting would be the conclusion, the surrender. Emily followed him into the kitchen, her eyes scanning her father's face, searching for signs of defeat. George motioned for them to sit. He poured the coffee slowly, deliberately, letting the steam curl upward. "I've listened to both of you," he began, his voice calm. "I've heard what you've said about the house, about my savings, or what you think I don't have, and I've stayed quiet long enough." David leaned forward. "So you've decided?" George nodded, resting his hand on the wooden box. "Yes, I've decided it's time you knew the truth." He opened the box and pulled out the stack of folders he had so carefully guarded. He laid them flat on the table, one by one, until the manila covers filled the space between them. The children stared, confused at first. "These," George said, sliding one folder toward David, another toward Emily, "are statements from the retirement accounts I've kept for over 35 years. Every overtime shift, every raise, every spare dollar your mother and I could set aside, we put them here, quietly, consistently, year after year." David flipped open the first folder, his confident expression faltering as his eyes scanned the numbers. His lips parted, but no words came out. Emily leaned over, her hand trembling as she traced the figures with her finger. "It can't be," she whispered. "It is," George replied. "It's all protected by law. No one but me has access, not you, not anyone else. I've built this not just for survival, but for dignity, for the life your mother and I promised ourselves we would have when the work was done." David set the folder down, his face pale. "Why didn't you tell us?" George's eyes softened. "Because I didn't save to impress you. I didn't do it for applause. I did it so that when this day came, when you looked at me and thought I had nothing, I could show you that a lifetime of sacrifice means something, that I am not a man to be dismissed." Emily's voice cracked. "Dad, we didn't know. We thought." "You thought wrong," George said gently but firmly. "You saw gray hair and worn shoes and assumed I was empty. You forgot that I built your childhood out of sweat and sleepless nights. You forgot that quiet work often builds the strongest foundations." The room was silent except for the faint hiss of the furnace. David stared at the papers as though they were written in another language. Emily wiped at her eyes, her cheeks flushed with shame. George leaned back, his hands folded calmly now. "This house is not leaving my name, and I am not signing anything. What I've saved is mine, and it is untouchable. You can't leverage it, you can't spend it, and you can't take it. It is the proof that even when you thought I had nothing, I had more than you imagined." The words landed like stones dropped into still water, rippling through the air. David opened his mouth, then closed it again. For once, the man who always had a plan, always had an answer, could find none. Emily reached for her father's hand, her fingers light, hesitant. "Dad, I'm sorry. We didn't see you. We only saw what we wanted to see." George gave her hand a small squeeze. "Then see me now, not as a burden, not as a man with nothing, but as your father who has already fought his battles and still stands." For the first time in weeks, George felt the weight lift from his chest. He had spoken his truth, and he had shown them the reality no dismissal could erase. The retirement fund wasn't just money. It was his shield, his statement, his quiet triumph. And in that kitchen, with the papers spread out like proof of his life, his children finally fell silent. The kitchen grew quiet after the papers were laid bare. The only sound was the faint ticking of the wall clock, steady and relentless, like the years George had spent building what now lay before them. Emily was the first to speak. Her voice was small, almost childlike. "Dad, all these years, why didn't you tell us?" George looked at her with a tenderness that surprised even himself. "Because it wasn't about telling. It was about doing. Your mother and I made a promise long ago. We would prepare for the future so we'd never have to depend on anyone. We didn't want to live our later years as a burden or as a story of regret. We wanted dignity, and dignity is something you build quietly, one sacrifice at a time." David sat rigid, his eyes still fixed on the numbers in front of him. For once, the confidence that usually wrapped him like armor seemed to have cracked. "We thought you had nothing," he admitted softly. "We thought you needed us to step in." George shook his head. "You mistook quiet for weakness. You mistook simplicity for emptiness, but a man's worth isn't measured by what you see on the surface. It's measured by the years behind him, the sacrifices no one noticed, the choices that weren't easy but were made anyway." He leaned forward now, his gaze steady, his voice firm but kind. "I'm not angry with you. Disappointed, yes. But more than that, I want you to learn. Money isn't everything, but preparation is. If you live your life spending as if tomorrow doesn't matter, one day you'll find yourself cornered and there won't be anyone to blame but yourself. Build something safe. Build something untouchable. Build dignity." Emily wiped her eyes, nodding silently. David lowered his gaze, unable to argue. George reached out and closed the folders, stacking them neatly once again. "This house will stay mine. This fund will remain mine, and I will live out my years as I intended, with the peace your mother and I fought for. You don't need to worry about me. You need to worry about yourselves and how you'll prepare for your own futures." The silence that followed wasn't heavy this time. It was thoughtful, almost cleansing. For the first time in weeks, George felt a sense of calm wash over him. He had not only defended his life's work, but he had reminded his children, perhaps even taught them, the very lessons he and Margaret had built their marriage on. He rose from the table, placed the wooden box back under his arm, and said softly, "I hope one day you'll understand this not as defiance but as love, because that's what it always was." Emily whispered, "We do, Dad. At least I do." George gave her a small smile. He glanced at David, who still said nothing, but whose eyes carried something George hadn't seen in a long time: respect, reluctant but real. Later that night, when the house was quiet again, George sat in Margaret's old chair by the fire. The scarf still rested in her basket, unfinished. He reached down, touched the yarn, and whispered, "We did it, Margaret. We kept our promise. They know now." The fire crackled, warm and steady, like the quiet triumph of a man who had spent a lifetime preparing for the day he would finally be seen. And so, dear friends, this was the story of George Miller, the father who was dismissed as having nothing until he revealed the strength of a lifetime of preparation. His lesson is one for all of us: prepare for tomorrow even when no one is watching. Build dignity, not just wealth. Thank you for spending your time with Family Shadows today. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to subscribe, share it with someone who needs the reminder, and keep these lessons alive in your own family. Until we meet again, I wish you health, peace, and a home filled with love. May your days be steady, your years be kind, and may your family always find happiness together.